going back to those English composers that we were talking about earlier. So these are called the English Pastoral School or the English Nationalist School. They have a kind of slightly funny nickname, which is the Cowpat composers, because English countryside, realistically, you're just kind of going to associate it with cows and cowpat. So these guys were active in the early to mid 20th century, and they based their work on not only English folk music, kind of like Bartók was doing in Hungary, but also Tudor music, which is a very kind of strong essence of the English sound, as well as the kind of the English landscape. The leading figures were Ralph Vaughan Williams, Gustav Holst, George Butterworth, John Ireland, Edmund Rubbra, Gerald Finzi, Peter Warlock and Frank Bridge. So, what these guys were doing in the late 19th century, backtracking just a tiny bit, British art, notably by Turner and the Pre-Raphaelites, what they were doing was kind of depicting an English landscape that was a symbol of nostalgia and regret. So what had happened was a lot of these areas in the English countryside were not accessible to normal people. They were owned privately. We'll look into kind of when and why this happened later. And because of this, people couldn't go and walk. So this kind of area in the Lake District where Wordsworth was going around, a lot of this was actually not accessible to people. You could kind of jump over the fence and go through, however you'd be trespassing, you could be fined and put in jail and things like that depending on how long you were there, what you were doing. So yeah, it was quite different back then to what we have now, where we can just kind of wander around for free in pretty much everywhere really. There was this kind of regret that all of these areas were closed, but also they were kind of nostalgic of the time before the Industrial Revolution. So because cities were expanding, because people were rushing there to work in the factories, more factories were being built as technology moved on. You now have the massive textile factories. This is kind of before technology, but this comes along later. It's just kind of growing and growing and growing. Metal work, things like this are all now made in factories instead of, you know, a tiny little blacksmith in the country and so on. So they were kind of regretting this, and they were expressing this sense of loss, the loss of the true English essence, which was the countryside. At this point, only 21.9% of the population, this is from the 1911 census, actually still resided in rural areas. Everyone else lived now in the city. What had happened here was, whereas before you'd have the poorer workers in the countryside and they would kind of be doing the agricultural work, they were now in the city, but because of this, the countryside was now free. Well, it wasn't free. There were less people living there because of the private landlords as well. There was kind of a switch in class, so whereas it was rich people in the city, poor people in the country, it kind of swapped, where you had the rich people in the countryside living in the stately homes, owning all the land, and then all of the poorer people, the factory workers, the agricultural workers, now in the cities, in the factories. So because of this, the countryside was in a great need for this kind of revitalisation, a kind of, you know, bumping up what was happening. And this came with the arts and crafts movement. So these were anti-industrial revolution companies such as Morris & Co, who I'm going to use as an example, and they were claiming again that the essence of England came from the countryside. And this was particularly apparent in their textile patterns. Morris & Co would use a lot of designs that were kind of inspired by nature, birds, fruit, and this kind of thing. However, whilst they're kind of bumping up the countryside in terms of their natural patterns and things, what was difficult is, you know, this was still quite a fancy brand, this was still expensive, this wasn't really helping with the class shift and difference from the cities and the countryside. However, one thing that did change this was the founding of the National Trust. In 1895, what the National Trust did was they started to reclaim land back from these private, very rich landlords and open them up to the public. So this is why you can now go and visit stately homes and you're free to look around, and they kind of have a little gift shop and things like that. Whilst the home itself may still be owned by a very wealthy family, it's also open to the public. You're allowed to walk on the grounds at, say, Burley House and places like this. and also a lot of other National Trust areas. The Lake District is very heavily now owned by the National Trust, and what would happen is the lake's now open, people could walk around and they could kind of experience this world, which was the world of Wordsworth, for themselves. Music festivals also began to be run in, particularly in Aldeburgh and Gloucester, so this allowed city dwellers to go into the countryside and experience folk dancing, folk music, food, things like this, and kind of get more in touch with the little things that made the country unique. You know, a lot of these things that had been forgotten. And this excited a lot of the composers of the time, Vaughan Williams and so on, and what they did was this kind of encouraged them to go and do what Bartók had done and take their massive recording devices and go deep into the countryside and start collecting all of the folk music. What they did here was they would kind of rearrange some of them, so folk songs would then become these kind of beautiful a cappella choral works, or they'd be for voice and piano, and they'd kind of just reintroduce these through music and help, you know, bring countryside back as, you know, something to be proud of. Another thing that happened with composers is often one composer would become directly kind of associated with a more particular part of the country, which would either be where they were from or where they'd, you know, where they lived or had lived for a long time, and this particular region, so it's not just kind of national, but now it's kind of regional within that, they would collect folk songs from that region or specialise in those kinds of things. In the pastoral poems from the Renaissance, you know, the madrigals that we were looking at before, whilst they were depicting an idyllic love within this natural landscape, what these composers are doing now, the English Nationalist School, what they're doing is they're depicting an idyllic landscape, which is kind of representing their idyllic love for their homeland, I guess. So again, there's this kind of stepping back. They're not literally depicting the trees, they are depicting their love for England, and through that for the trees which are in England and kind of make up England. I'm specifying England just not to be like that person who's like England, not Britain, but because these were all English composers and they all collected English folk song. Scottish folk song is very different, it sounds different. Hello Musicianship 5. So the difficulty I have is whenever my card runs out of space when I'm filming, it doesn't tell me. So the last half hour's worth that I filmed, because I mean I'd like chop it or make it smaller, I actually do like several hours worth of footage that I have to kind of, you know, make smaller, because I just sit there saying and kind of going, oh, it's all gone. And now it's very late at night and I'm doing it all again in order to get it up in time for Saturday. So that whole thing where I use my notes to save time, why do I bother? Look, Bach's gone to sleep. He sleeps that late at night. I should be playing Minecraft or something, not doing, you know, saying everything again. So excuse me if I'm really, really tired or look like I'm about to cry. Scottish music's very different from English music, as is Irish folk music, and because of the differences, you know, this is why it's an English school as opposed to a British school of music, just to kind of clarify that distinction. Only thing we really had left to say on the topic of the English Nationalist School was that in these pieces there is still a sense of artistic distancing. So what this means is that even though a part of the landscape will kind of be described in the music, be it the mountains, the river, the birds or whatever, that's still not really what the piece is about. Within this landscape the composers are trying to find this kind of almighty truth, transcendent truth that they're finding through this idyllic world that they are depicting. Because even though they're depicting an idyllic landscape, their lives were far from idyllic. Once again, this was kind of clashing with the World War II kind of era. Basically, during the World War, it didn't matter what composer you were, in what country or anything like that, the war affected them somehow. It affected everyone and everyone's artistic output, no matter if you were a composer, artist, you know, a painter, a poet, whatever, it was going to affect you. A lot of these composers, they served in the war, or they had friends who died, particularly Ireland and Finzi as well. They were very traumatised by a lot of these events, so when coming back to their homeland, or kind of when peace in their homeland was restored, it was kind of, oh, it's this idyllic peace, but at the same time it's like, why am I so broken inside? Again, it still kind of harks back, deliberately or not, to the idea from the madrigal earlier, where, you know, this is so beautiful and this is, you know, such a stunning landscape, but at the same time this is not a perfect world, and it's kind of, you know, not quite right. So that's all I had left to say on that. Do check out some work by Vaughan Williams and Holst and Finzi Island, Warlock and the other composers from the Nationalist School. I will put a listening list at the end of the video, but you've been listening to the Vaughan Williams throughout the background of this element, so you know, you're kind of getting the idea. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is I wanted to set you a challenge, or at least get you thinking about a challenge. This is quite a nice idea. I might save it for when we come back together, be it in the autumn or the spring, wherever it may be. We are very lucky in the Peterborough area that we've got kind of our own, it's Lincolnshire technically, our own poet who we can kind of draw from. So it's like, so whilst Wordsworth is in the Lake District, the Fens and East Anglia have John Clare. So John Clare was born in Helpston, which is a small village between Peterborough and Stamford. He was born in 1793 and died in 1864. And you can still visit his cottage, I mean not now, but in general, when all this is over, do recommend it. And you can kind of see where he lived for a long time and some of his work, and get to know him a bit better as a person. I mean, he's dead, but like his character and his poets and stuff. His poems.